Hello Yari, it's Miss Simpson here, and today we're going to be thinking about Victorian schools and the experiences that children had attending them. So the first thing to do, as always, is to write down your title question for today, which is on the top of the screen there, and it's how does Bronte use language to convey the experiences in a Victorian school? So from that, you'll be able to gather that we're going to be looking closely at how writers use language to show us those experiences that children had during the Victorian times when in school. Now, before we get on to that, from your project work on the Victorian voices so far, you should already know a little bit about the lives of children during the Victorian era. So before we begin to look at their experiences in school, I want you to think about what you've learned so far and what you can recall about the jobs that children may have had to do during that time. So your first task is to use the 3 images that you can see on your screen and write down what jobs you think they relate to in terms of child labour during the Victorian times. Now you should also have read some texts about each of these jobs. So if you can, as an extra challenge, as well as writing down the job that they relate to, can you write down the name of the author who wrote about each of these experiences that was in the project work you've been doing so far? So once you've got your title down for the day, pause the video and note down your 3 answers relating to those 3 images. Now hopefully from image number 1 you'll be able to recognise that that is a child working as a chimney sweep, and that was written about by William Blake in his poem The Chimney Sweeper. And your second image, hopefully you've also been able to recognise that that's an image of children working in an underground coal mine. Now underneath the ground the children had many different jobs, such as being a hurrier, a trapper, a getter, as well as many other ones, and those were written about by Elizabeth Barrett Browning in her poem The Cry of the Children. And lastly, in that third image, hopefully identified this one as it's quite a famous one. That is an image of the workhouse, but in particular that one is of the workhouse that is described in Charles Dickens' text Oliver Twist, where he famously asks for more. Hopefully you've been able to identify those kind of jobs and roles, but today we're going to move on from that a little bit and look at now what their experiences were like in Victorian schools. So Victorian schools were very different to the type of school that you're used to attending today, as you might be able to see in the image that's on your screen there. So the experiences of school that we're going to read about in a little bit are not what you might expect, so certainly not going to be what you're used to. So what I want you to do before we begin is think about what differences can you already begin to see between that classroom pictured there and the type of classroom that you're usually in school. Think about what you can see in terms of the room, the children, the equipment, the people, as well as maybe the things like the clothing. Look around that whole image there. Before we start actually reading our text for today, can you note down what differences you can see from that image and perhaps therefore make inferences about the experiences those children might also have? So I'll give you a chance in a second to pause the video and see if you could try and note down maybe 10 differences between that image and the type of classroom you're usually sitting in. So some of the things you might have picked up upon might be the number of children in the room, as there's a much bigger class size there than we usually have in our classrooms. And if you look around the room as well, you might begin to notice things about the lack of displays on the walls. There's obviously 2 members of staff in there, and you might have noticed that they're writing on something very different to what we normally write on. But there are lots and lots of other differences between schools that we can't see in this image, that we can only gather from reading about those experiences. In order to understand those experiences a little bit better, it's important we know a bit more about the context of Victorian schools in order to therefore understand the book that we're going to read a section of in a moment. So a reminder there on the screen that context, and when we use that word, because I'll be using it quite a few times today, context is when we're talking about society and what society was like during the time a particular text was written. So we keep referring back to the Victorian society today because it was very different then, and therefore what we're going to read about is going to be very different. So in order to understand what society was like during that time, we need to find out a little bit of contextual information. So if you have a look on your screen there, I want you to note down two subheadings: who went to school and what were schools like. And if you set it out just as it is on the screen there, leave yourself some space to note down 5 facts underneath each of those subheadings. So we're going to find out who went to school during the Victorian times and also what schools were like, because we can see some differences from that image, but there's a lot of other things happening behind that image, something that the image can't tell us. So once you've noted down those 2 subheadings and left your space to write down your 5 facts, I'm going to put some information up on the screen that you can either read yourself and note down facts from, or you might already have some of your own knowledge where you can begin to write down those facts already, or you might even want to use the internet to do some additional research. But you need to be able to explain who went to school during the Victorian times and what their schools were like. So once you've got those 2 subheadings, I'm going to give you some information. You're going to need to spend about 8 minutes. So pause your video in a second or go onto the internet, research it yourself and pull out 5 facts underneath each of those subheadings that you can note down to help us understand exactly what schools were like in the context of the Victorian era. So here's the information for you to read. So I'm going to pause your video now for a few minutes to find your 5 facts for each subheading. So you might have picked out some of these key pieces of information. Firstly, you might have looked at the fact that while school was initially only for the rich, in 1870 the Education Act changed that, so both the poor and the rich went to school and it became compulsory for ages 5 to 13. But as it tells us there, these schools were very, very different depending on whether you were rich or poor. Now in particular, those schools that were for poorer children were known as ragged schools, and often they were less well equipped and had much vastly different experiences to those who attended the schools for the rich. Now that's the kind of school we're going to read about in a second, so that's an important thing to note down, that idea of ragged schools. In addition, what you might have also noted down is that class sizes were much bigger. We saw that in the image earlier, but they could be anywhere between 70 and 80 pupils in one class in schools in poorer areas, or those ragged schools as we mentioned before. And we also saw from the image that children wrote on slates, were using chalk, but what's important is that that was cleared at the end of every day, so children had to memorise everything that they noted down. There's no exercise books that they could take away and revise from. One other huge difference between schools then and now was discipline. So as it tells us there, children were often beat by canes, they were humiliated by teachers for a range of different things, sometimes having to wear hats with the letter D on that were known as the dunce hats, or sometimes even placed in punishment baskets. Now all of these things obviously no longer exist in schools today, but when we start reading the text in a second, you need to be thinking about all of these contextual factors. If children were afraid to be punished, how do you think they differently behaved in schools? How do you think their experiences of schools were very different because of the terrible conditions that they often faced? Now the extract we're going to read is from a book called Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, and in the novel, Jane, the main character, is orphaned and has endured a pretty hard life living with one of her relatives. She's sent away to the charity-run boarding school Lowood, and initially she thinks it's going to be a great opportunity for her, she's going to get a great education. But what she finds there is that actually the situation at the school is a lot worse, and that there are some pretty terrible conditions, including giving little food, little warmth, clothing or care. Now we're going to read a short extract in a second, and I want you to think about how Bronte conveys Jane's experiences. So as you read it, think all the time about what's Jane experiencing at this school and how is Bronte using language in order to show us that. Now the extract, as you'll see, has some quite difficult vocabulary in it, particularly those words I've highlighted in bold. Now as you're reading this through, look up any of those words that you don't understand, particularly, as I've said, those ones that are in bold. We will go through those words in a little bit, but any of the others that you don't understand as you're reading through, especially ones that will help you understand Jane's experiences at the school, look them up using the internet or the dictionary, and hopefully you will see that Jane's experiences are quite different to ones we would encounter at school today. So if you want to pause your video now and read this through a couple of times, make sure that you've understood it. Hopefully now that you've read that, you've begun to understand some of the experiences that Jane faced while she was at Lowood School. Before we start looking at it in a bit more detail, these words here, those that are highlighted in bold, that are really important, not just because they're quite ambitious vocabulary choices, but also because these words here in particular tell us a lot about Jane's experiences at the school. So if you haven't done so already, as you were reading the extract, I want you to look up what each of these words means, either using a dictionary or the internet, and think about what each of them reveals about how Jane feels while she's at the school, because they're really important words in showing us Jane's experiences. So pause your video now to get those definitions of the key vocabulary. Now I won't go through every single one of these words, as hopefully you've managed to find some good definitions, but if we look at these words and what they suggest to us, the first key word you should have found is irksome, which is something that's annoying or irritating, which Bronte uses to describe Jane's irksome struggle at getting used to the school. So we start thinking about that word and our question for today about her experiences in the school. That begins to suggest to us that Jane is finding it very difficult. She's finding it quite frustrating that she can't get used to the habits of the school. And that links to that second word on your list, habituating, which is trying to get used to something, suggesting to us that Jane is finding the school quite a challenging change, that it's a difficult environment for her to adapt to. You'll also see lots of words on this list such as scanty and deficiency, which mean that something is insufficient or lacking or there's a shortage of, which Bronte has used to describe the shortage of food, which, another word on your list, leaves the girls famished. So hopefully what you can begin to see through this vocabulary is that Jane's experiences are ones of real difficulty and struggle, particularly with the lack of food, clothing, and particularly the harsh conditions that they're exposed to when they're walking to the church, which is where we see her use the word flayed to describe Jane's skin almost being stripped off by that really aggressive wind. Now to take this further, we now need to start looking at a close analysis of some of the key quotations that are going to help us to answer today's question: how does Bronte use language to convey the experiences in a Victorian school? Now you'll see on screen I've picked out 3 key quotations that I think really highlight Jane's experiences to the reader. And we're going to do what we always do in lessons, pick out those key quotes and then analyse closely the language that's being used in them, trying to think about what Bronte is showing us that the school was like, how she's showing us through that language, and then why she's showing us that. What is that showing the reader about Jane's experiences at school? So we're going to start for now just with quotation 1. So if you first of all note down that quotation, leave some space around it though, leave some space to add some annotations. We're going to think about how the fear of failure in these points harassed me worse than the physical hardships shows us Jane's experiences at the school. So once you've noted down quotation 1, I want you to think about what words in there are conveying those experiences to us, and what are the connotations of those words? What are they making us think or understand about Jane's experiences at the school? Now I've put some in bold to give you a little bit of a hint of which ones you might want to focus on, but if you make sure that you leave plenty space around it, write down just quote number 1 and then see if you can come up with maybe 3 things that you could say about the language of that quote, particularly, as I said, focusing on those words in bold. That should take you, I'd say, around about 4 minutes or so. So if you pause your video and have a go at quotation number 1. So you might have started with picking out the words fear or failure. Now these 2 words are really good examples of emotive language. So thinking about showing the emotions of a character, fear and failure, and also an example of alliteration as well. And so those words are used by Bronte to really emphasise Jane's fear of doing something wrong. And as we know from the context of the Victorian era, she's possibly afraid of punishment as a result of doing something wrong. So we know that during that time that was commonly used in Victorian schools. You might have also picked out the verb harassed. Now when we think about being harassed, we think about constantly being under pressure or being under strain. So that word suggests to us that Jane is constantly under this fear and pressure. So she never has any relief from fear at the school at all. And the last one that I identified in bold for you there, physical, particularly helps us think about not just the way she feels emotionally, but also that she's quite often in physical as well as emotional turmoil. So that might be Bronte's way of creating additional sympathy in the reader for Jane's suffering, because we know she's not just suffering emotionally but also physically as well. So there's lots we could say about that one quotation by focusing in on those key words. Particularly we want to think about how Bronte is making us as a reader feel sympathetic towards Jane's position, particularly because of her fear of all of that punishment that was so common in Victorian schools. Now that we've got lots of notes on the first quote, I'd like you to try and challenge yourself to do the next 2 on your own. So try to do exactly as we've just done, write the quotation down, leave yourself plenty of space around it, and try to pick out at least 3 things you can say about each of the quotes, exactly as I say as we've just done. Use the words in bold as a starting point. You can pick out other ones as well. And don't forget to go back and look at the definitions that you wrote down of some of those more complicated words earlier on, and look up any others that you're still not sure of. So in a second, note down your quotation, try and say at least 3 things about it. Spend, I would recommend, about 4 minutes on each quote. So if you want to pause your video now and give that a go. Now that you've got some great annotations on all of those quotes, it's time to write up our ideas in order to answer today's question, which is at the top of your screen there. How does Bronte use language to convey the experiences in a Victorian school? So we're going to use the what, how, why structure that you should be familiar with from lessons, but if you're not, it's on the right hand side of the screen there. And I'm going to take you through an example to show you how you can now write a really clear but detailed paragraph in order to change your annotations into analysis. So what we can see there is that we're going to start with the what. What is Bronte showing school during that time was like? What is she showing us about school? Then we're going to move on to the how. How is she showing us this through language? So that's where we need to zoom in on those key language choices and explain their connotations and what they suggest. And then we're going to do the why section. Why is she showing this to the reader? What does she want the reader to think or feel or understand? So you should be able to see the example paragraph is divided up into those 3 sections. You don't need to leave those spaces in between them. That's just there so you can see those 3 clear sections of the paragraph. So you might want to take a few minutes to read the paragraph through, especially the how section. As you can see, that bit's a bit longer than the other sections. Should always be the most detailed part of your paragraph, as this is where you're going to explore in real detail the different language choices that the writer has used. So you might want to pause now, read it through, but then I'll talk you through it as well. So let's look at the first line first of all, the what. Bronte conveys the hardships experienced by children at some Victorian schools by describing the physical suffering of Jane. Now you'll see in there some of the words from the question have been used. So the word conveys, you've also got experienced, you've got the words Victorian schools. But what it's done is it's gone a little bit further than just repeating the question. It's then said something about those experiences. So here we're focusing on the physical experiences of suffering that Jane went through. You can change that to any of the experiences that she went through the lack of food or her fear of being punished. You can change that to whatever your quotation focuses on. Then if we look at the second part of the paragraph, the how, you'll notice that we've got a quote which is quite long, but what we've then done with that quote is we've picked out some really important things. Firstly, the adjective cold has been repeated, and we've also picked out the verb paralysed. So try to pick out one or two, maybe even three key words that you could then talk about. Try and label them with things like adjectives, repetition, verbs, but more importantly, don't forget to say what those words suggest. So if you look at that very last line of the how section, the verb paralysed could show the effect of the cold, but also has connotations of being frozen with fear. Use that word connotations to explore the different things that a word could mean. And then our last section, our why section, this suggests to the reader that the children were too frightened to complain or ask for help. So it's getting you to think about in this section here what Bronte might want the reader to understand or think or feel. Looking at the very last line, we've suggested that it's to create sympathy for the poorer children in society. Use your contextual knowledge here. So use that list that we wrote earlier of the contextual facts about Victorian schools. And that will help you to explain how Victorian schools were different, but also how Bronte is trying to get the reader to think and feel in a particular way about those poorer children who attended perhaps those ragged schools that we discussed earlier. So now it's over to you to try and write your own what, how, why paragraph answering today's big question. Try to use one of the other quotations, either the one that we analysed together, number 1, or the second one that you looked at on your own. They're both on the bottom of the screen there. Now I've put on some sentence stems to help you get started if you're a little bit stuck, but don't forget you can go back and look at the example paragraph and use the bullet points on the side of the screen to help you to frame your answer. Try to give lots of detail if you can, especially in that how part. Try to talk about 2, maybe even 3 key words, their connotations, and then think about what Bronte is trying to suggest to the reader as a result of that. If you pause your video now, I would probably spend at least 10 minutes writing a really detailed paragraph explaining as much as you can about Bronte's use of language to show us those experiences in a Victorian school. Now that you've completed your paragraph, we've almost come to the end of today's session, and although we haven't got time to read any more of Jane Eyre, later on in the text some of the children are punished using some of the methods we learnt about earlier on in today's session. So before I end this lesson with you, I want you to just finish off by checking you can remember what each of these images relate to in terms of Victorian schools and punishment. So you'll see there's 3 images on the screen there linking back to what we learned earlier on. And I want you now to think about how you think it would feel to experience this. How do you think it would feel to be a child like Jane and receive those punishments during school?